If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Marshall Hayes. I'm 42 years old, and I'm the head ranger at Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota. It's a lonely job, but that's exactly why I took it. 3 years ago, I lost my wife and son in a fire. Our house burned down while I was away on duty, and I've been carrying that guilt ever since. Some days, it feels like the smoke from that night never really left me. I came out here to escape, to get as far away from people as possible. The Boundary Waters are remote, endless stretches of pine forests, frozen lakes, and silence. It's beautiful, but it's also harsh. In winter, temperatures drop to 40 below, and blizzards can trap you for days. Most people wouldn't last a week out here, but for me, it's easier than dealing with the world outside. I live in a small wooden ranger station that creaks with every gust of wind. There's no electricity, just kerosene lamps and a wood stove to keep warm. My only company is Luis Morales, my deputy ranger. He's younger than me by a few years and always trying to get me to talk about things I'd rather not talk about. He means well, but I keep my distance. Then there's Dr. Elaine Foster. She's a wildlife biologist studying wolf populations in the area. She's smart, tough, and doesn't take any nonsense from anyone, not even me. I admire her in a way I haven't admired anyone in a long time, but I don't let it show. Every day out here is about survival, chopping wood, checking traps, patrolling the trails, but lately, something feels off. The animals are acting strange. Wolves howling during the day, moose wandering too close to the station, even lynx showing up where they shouldn't be. And then there are the tracks, bizarre tracks that don't make sense. I've been seeing them for weeks now. Footprints in the snow that look like they belong to a wolf at first glance, but then change halfway through, like something walking upright on two legs. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe ice melting in weird patterns. But now I'm not so sure. I carry my son's old pocket compass with me everywhere I go. It stopped working the day of the fire. It just points in random directions now, but for some reason I can't bring myself to throw it away. Lately though, even that compass has been acting strange. Sometimes it spins wildly when I'm out on patrol, other times it points somewhere deep into the forest. Lewis says it's just magnetic interference from all the iron deposits around here. Maybe he's right, or maybe there's something else going on. Winter in the Boundary Waters is no joke. By January, the snow is so deep it swallows your boots with every step. The lakes are frozen solid, and the wind cuts through you like a knife. Out here, the cold isn't just something you feel, it's something you fight, every single day. The thing about this place is how quiet it gets. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the crunch of snow under your boots. It's peaceful, sure, but sometimes that silence feels heavy, like the forest is holding its breath. Lately though, it hasn't been so quiet. There's been this strange hum in the air, low and faint, like a far-off engine that never gets closer. Lewis says it's just the wind playing tricks on us. Maybe he's right. But I've been out here long enough to know when something feels wrong. The animals know it too. Wolves are howling during the day now, their cries echoing through the trees like warnings. A few days ago, I found a moose carcass near one of the trails. It looked like something had torn it apart, not eaten it, just shredded it. The weirdest part, the blood trail didn't lead anywhere. It just stopped in the middle of a frozen lake. Dr. Foster came by the station yesterday to check on some of her tracking equipment. She said her radio keeps cutting out, static and strange noises she can't explain. Probably just solar flare, she told me with a shrug, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Even my compass has been acting up more than usual. Yesterday, I was out checking traps when it started spinning like crazy again. When it finally stopped, it pointed straight toward a patch of forest I've always avoided. Dense pines that block out most of the light, even during the day. Locals call it Dead Man's Grove. They say it's cursed or haunted or something like that. I've never believed in those kinds of stories until now. The blizzards haven't helped either. They come out of nowhere. One minute the sky is clear, and the next you're caught in a whiteout so thick you can't see your own hands in front of your face. It's like the weather has a mind of its own. The nearest town is 45 miles away, and with the roads buried under snow, we're completely cut off from civilization until spring. Our only connection to the outside world is an old radio at the station, and even that's been acting up lately. I've seen a lot in my time as a ranger: wildfire, bear attacks, even a plane crash once. But this feels different. It's not just nature being unpredictable, it's like something is watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. I don't scare easily. I've been through too much for that. But there's a part of me that can't shake this feeling. Whatever's out there isn't just dangerous, it's unnatural. It started with the tracks. I was out on patrol, walking along one of the trails near Dead Man's Grove. The snow was fresh from last night's storm, untouched, except for a set of prints leading off into the trees. At first, I thought they were wolf tracks. Big paws pressed deep into the snow. But as I followed them, they changed. The paw prints stretched out, grew longer, until they looked more like human footprints, bare feet. In this weather, I stopped cold, staring at the tracks. They led deeper into the forest, but something told me not to follow. I don't know what it was. Instinct, maybe. But every hair on my neck stood on end. I turned back toward the station, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Later that day, Lewis came rushing in from his patrol, pale as a sheet. "I saw something," he said, his voice shaking. "A wolf?" But it wasn't a wolf. "What do you mean?" I asked. "It was walking on two legs," he said. "Like a person." I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that maybe he'd just seen a bear or something, but deep down I knew he wasn't wrong. The tracks I'd found earlier were proof enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard voices, soft whispers calling my name from somewhere far away. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed about my family. My wife and son were standing at the edge of the forest, smiling at me like they used to before the fire. "Come with us," they said. "We're waiting for you." I woke up sweating and shaking. It felt so real, like they were right there in front of me. The next morning, Lewis told me 3 hunters had gone missing near Dead Man's Grove. They'd been out tracking wolves but never came back. Their families said they'd heard strange noises before losing contact. Voices calling their names from the woods. I went out to investigate their cabin later that day. What I found still makes my skin crawl. The walls were covered in scratches. Hundreds of tally marks carved into the wood, like someone had been counting days or something else. There were symbols too, circles and spirals that didn't make any sense to me. The air inside was freezing cold, colder than it should have been even with the storm outside. When I stepped back out into the snow, my compass started spinning again, pointing toward Dead Man's Grove. That evening, an Ojibwe elder came by the station to warn us about something he called the Shredded One. He wouldn't say much, just that it walks in winter and takes what it wants from anyone foolish enough to cross its path. "Stay away from the grove," he said before leaving. "It's not safe." I wanted to believe it was just superstition, a story passed down through generations, but everything that's been happening tells me otherwise. Dr. Foster joined me on patrol yesterday to check on her research team's equipment near one of the lakes. We found a moose carcass hanging 15 feet up in a tree, its insides torn out like something had gutted it for fun. "What kind of animal could do this?" she asked quietly. "I don't think it was an animal," I said. The blood trail led up another tree and then across the frozen lake before disappearing completely. Foster didn't say anything after that. She just stared at her notes like she was trying to make sense of it all. That night, my compass started working again, but instead of pointing north like it should have, it kept shifting directions every few minutes, always toward Dead Man's Grove. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself over and over that there had to be a logical explanation. Wolves don't walk on two legs, animals don't leave tracks that vanish into thin air, and people don't just disappear without a trace. But the more I saw, the harder it became to deny. It was Lewis who first called it out by name. "You think it's real, don't you?" he asked one night as we sat by the wood stove, the flames casting long shadows on the walls. The thing the elder talked about, the Shredded One. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. because deep down I was starting to think he might be right. The next day, things got worse. Dr. Foster's research team had been camping near one of the lakes, tracking wolf movements. When we went to check on them, their campsite was empty. Tents ripped open, supplies scattered everywhere, but no sign of the team, no footprints leading away from the site either, just nothing. We found one of them a few hours later, or what was left of him. He was slumped against a tree, his body torn apart like the moose we'd seen earlier, but he wasn't dead. Not yet. His eyes were wide with terror as he whispered something over and over. "It's in the snow. It's in the snow." We tried to get him back to the station, but he didn't make it. By the time we got there, he was gone. That night, Lewis said he saw something outside, something big moving between the trees. "It was watching us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I could feel it. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside, but there was nothing there, just the wind howling through the pines and those strange tracks in the snow. Later that evening, I caught Lewis standing by the window, staring out into the darkness like he was in some kind of trance. "Do you hear it?" he asked without looking at me. "Hear what?" I said. "The music," he whispered. "It's beautiful." I pulled him away from the window and made him sit down by the stove, but I could tell something wasn't right with him after that. The next morning, my compass pointed straight toward Dead Man's Grove again. I decided to follow it this time. I had to know what was out there. Dr. Foster insisted on coming with me, despite my protests. "If this thing is real," she said, "we need to understand it." We followed the compass deep into the forest until we reached a frozen waterfall. That's when we saw it. Or at least part of it. At first, it looked like a wolf, gaunt and mangy with patchy fur clinging to its bony frame. But as we watched, it stood up on two legs and turned toward us. Its face, I'll never forget its face. It looked almost human, but wrong, like someone had taken pieces of different animals and stitched them together into something that shouldn't exist. It stared at us for what felt like an eternity before disappearing into the trees without a sound. Foster was shaking as we made our way back to the station. "That wasn't an animal," she said quietly. "That was something else." That night, my son appeared at the window of the ranger station again, just like in my dream. He looked exactly as I remembered him, small and smiling with his favorite red scarf wrapped around his neck. "Let me in, Dad," he said softly, his breath fogging up the glass. For a moment, I almost opened the door, but then I remembered what Lewis had said about hearing music and seeing things that weren't really there. When I blinked, my son was gone. I thought things couldn't get worse. I was wrong. The morning after my son appeared at the window, Lewis was gone. His bed was empty, his coat and boots missing. I found a note on the table, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "When about it, I have to go. It's calling me." I grabbed my rifle and headed out into the snow, following his tracks. They led toward Dead Man's Grove, but halfway there they stopped, just like the others. No sign of him anywhere. I called out his name until my throat hurt, but all I got back was silence, and then something else. A voice, faint at first, but growing louder as I stood there in the snow. It sounded like Lewis, but it wasn't coming from the direction of his tracks. It was coming from behind me. "Marshall," it said, "help me." I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. The voice came again, closer this time. "Marshall." I ran back to the station as fast as I could, my compass spinning wildly in my pocket. Dr. Foster was waiting for me when I got back, her face pale and her hands shaking. "I found something," she said, holding up an old leather-bound notebook. It was a journal dated 1927. And it belonged to a park ranger who had worked here decades ago. The entries started off normal enough, notes about patrols, wildlife sightings, but as they went on, they grew darker. "The voices won't stop," one entry read.
"Oh, shit."
"They sound like my wife, my children, but I know it's not them." Another entry described seeing a creature in the woods, a wolf that walked like a man and whispered promises of safety if he followed it. The final entry was barely legible. "It's too late for me now. I made the pact to survive, but I've become something else." Foster flipped to the last page and pointed at a sketch, A crude drawing of a humanoid figure with patchy fur and hollow eyes. Beneath it were two words, "Disshredded One." Before we could process what we'd read, we heard howling outside, dozens of wolves surrounding the station. Their cries were deafening, echoing through the night like screams. Foster grabbed her notes while I loaded my rifle. "We need to get out of here," she said. But before we could move, something slammed against the door, a heavy thud that made the whole station shake. It wasn't a wolf, it was bigger than that. The door burst open, and for a second I thought it was Lewis standing there. But then I saw his eyes. They weren't his anymore. They were black and empty, like pits in his face. "I told you it's beautiful," he said before lunging at me. I fired instinctively, hitting him in the shoulder. He staggered back but didn't go down, his skin rippling like something was moving underneath it. Foster grabbed an iron poker from the stove and swung it at him with all her strength. This time he fell to the ground, writhing as black tendrils spilled out from under his clothes. "We can't stay here," Foster said, pulling me toward the back door. "It's not safe." We ran through the snow toward Dead Man's Grove, the only place my compass seemed to point anymore. The wolves followed us at a distance, their glowing eyes watching from between the trees. When we reached the grove, Foster stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. "Look." There were body parts scattered everywhere. Arms, legs, even pieces of faces, all arranged in strange patterns pointing toward an island in the middle of a frozen lake. "That's where it is," she said quietly. I didn't want to go any further. I wanted to turn around and run, but something deep inside me told me this wasn't over yet. The island was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop as we crossed the frozen lake, our boots crunching on the ice. Foster walked ahead of me, clutching the iron poker like it was her lifeline. My rifle felt heavier than usual in my hands. The closer we got, the worse the air felt, thick and heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. My compass spun wildly again, pointing straight toward a dark opening in the rocks ahead. "It's in there," Foster said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. This thing had taken Lewis, Foster's team, and God knows how many others over the years. If we didn't stop it now, it would keep taking. The cave was colder than anything I'd ever felt before, colder than the blizzards outside. The walls were covered in ancient pictographs, wolves, humans, and something in between, all painted in deep red that looked too fresh to be decades old. We found bones scattered everywhere, human and animal mixed together like they'd been chewed up and spit out. In the center of the cave was a pile of remains so large it looked like a throne, and then we saw it. The shredded one stepped out from the shadows, its body twisted and wrong. It wasn't just a wolf or a man, it was both and neither at the same time. Its fur hung in patches over skin that looked like it had been stitched together from different creatures. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow yet alive. It didn't attack us right away. Instead, it spoke, or maybe it mimicked speech. Its voice sounded like my son's at first, "Dad, come with us." Then it shifted to Foster's voice. "Plain, don't leave me." Foster froze beside me, her grip on the poker loosening as tears filled her eyes. "It's not real," I whispered to her. "Don't listen." The creature tilted its head, watching us with an eerie calm before stepping closer. I raised my rifle and fired, but the bullet barely slowed it down. It just absorbed the hit like it was nothing. Foster screamed as it lunged at us, claws swiping through the air. She swung the poker wildly, keeping it back for a moment before yelling at me, "Get to its heart. That's where it's weak." I didn't understand what she meant until I saw my compass again. It wasn't spinning anymore. It was pointing directly at the creature. I realized then that its heart wasn't just physical. It was tied to something deeper, something human. Foster threw herself at the creature, distracting it long enough for me to move closer to its lair. There was an old wooden chest buried under bones and snow. Inside was something small and blackened, a shriveled heart wrapped in iron chains. "This is what you were," I shouted at the creature as I held up its heart. "You were human once." It let out an ear-piercing scream that shook the entire cave as its body began shifting uncontrollably. human limbs sprouting from wolf-like features before disappearing again. Foster yelled for me to burn it as she fought off its claws with everything she had left. I grabbed my son's broken compass from my pocket, the one that hadn't worked since the fire, and pressed it against the heart. The iron sparked against the chains as flames erupted around us. The creature howled in agony as its body began to collapse inward, pulling itself apart piece by piece until there was nothing left but ash. I stumbled out of the cave with Foster behind me, both of us gasping for air as the cold wind hit our faces again. "It's gone," she said quietly, staring back at the cave entrance. But deep down I wasn't sure if that was true. We didn't talk much on the way back to the station. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees like it was trying to fill the silence. Foster walked ahead of me, her steps slow and heavy. I could see the iron poker in her hand, bent and blackened from the fight. When we got back, the station felt emptier than ever. Lewis was gone. The wolves were gone. Even the strange hum in the air had disappeared, but something still didn't feel right. Foster sat by the stove, staring into the flames without saying a word. I wanted to tell her it was over, that we'd won, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Because deep down I wasn't sure if it was true. The next morning, Foster packed up her things and left. She said she needed to file a report about what happened, but I think she just wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. I didn't blame her. I stayed behind to clean up what was left of the station. As I worked, I kept thinking about what the creature had said about joining my family in the forest. It wasn't just trying to scare me, it was offering me something, a way out of my pain. A way to be with them again. For a moment, I almost wished I'd taken it. A few days later, a rescue party arrived from town. They asked about Lewis and Foster's team, but I didn't have any answers for them, at least none they'd believe. They looked at me like I was crazy when I told them about the tracks and the voices in the cave. "Must have been the cold getting to you," one of them said with a nervous laugh. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just the cold. But then why did my compass start working again? It's sitting in my desk drawer now, pointing toward Dead Man's Grove like it always does. Sometimes at night I hear whispers coming from that direction, soft and distant, like voices carried on the wind. I don't know if it's really over, or if this thing will come back someday. All I know is that something changed out there in those woods, something that can't be undone. I've decided to leave Boundary Waters for good. It's time for me to move on, to try and find some kind of peace after everything that's happened. But before I go, there's one last thing I need to do. I've been tracking eclipse patterns in old Ojibwe legends, the ones that talk about doorway times. There's another eclipse coming in 30 years, and if what we saw in that cave is any indication, it might not be gone for good. As I write this, my reflection stares back at me from the window, tired eyes and a face that seemed too much. For a second, though, something changes. My eyes flash golden in the glass before going back to normal. I close my notebook and lock it away with the compass. Maybe someone will find it someday. Someone who can finish what we started. Until then, all I can do is wait. My name is Thomas Lockwood. I'm 30 years old, a Vietnam veteran, and as of last week the newest park ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. To be honest, I'm not sure why I took this job. Maybe it's because I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe because I didn't know what else to do. The truth is, caves terrify me. They always have. Back in Vietnam, I spent 3 days trapped underground in a tunnel after an explosion collapsed the entrance. It was pitch black, the air was so thick I could barely breathe, and every sound felt like it was coming from inside my head. By the time they pulled me out, I wasn't the same person anymore. Claustrophobia has been my shadow ever since. But here I am, standing at the entrance to one of the largest cave systems in the world, trying to face my fears head on. Exposure therapy, they call it. My therapist said it might help me reclaim control. Right now, all I feel is my heart pounding in my chest as I stare into the dark mouth of the cave. I'm not alone here. There's a team of rangers who've been working in this park for years. Catherine Reynolds is one of them. She's a senior ranger with more experience underground than anyone else on staff. She doesn't like me much. I can tell by the way she barely looks at me when we talk. Cat thinks I don't belong here, that I'm just some damaged war vet trying to play hero, but she hasn't said it outright yet. Then there's Victor Donovan, an old-timer who's lived in this area his whole life. He's not a ranger, but more of a historian, obsessed with cave folklore and legends that go back centuries. He's eccentric, always carrying around stacks of yellowed newspaper clippings and journals filled with scribbled notes about strange disappearances and ghost stories. Greg Patterson is probably the closest thing I have to a friend here. He's a cave photographer who spends most of his time underground capturing shots of formations and wildlife. He's been sick lately, pale and tired looking, but he still shows up every day with his camera slung over his shoulder like it weighs nothing. I've got my own quirks too. My Zippo lighter is always in my pocket. It's engraved with my platoon insignia from Vietnam. It's not much use down here since you can't smoke underground, but holding it makes me feel steady when my nerves start acting up. Today is my first day on the job, and Kat has reluctantly agreed to show me around some of the mapped passages near the surface. She hands me a helmet with a headlamp attached and gives me a rundown of safety procedures. Stay close to your partner, mark your path as you go, and never trust your sense of direction underground. The air inside the cave is cool and damp, carrying an earthy smell that clings to your skin. The walls are smooth limestone, carved by water over thousands of years. Cat moves ahead confidently while I try to keep up without looking like I'm struggling. "You okay back there?" she asks without turning around. "Yeah," I lie. The deeper we go, the quieter it gets. The sounds from outside, the wind rustling through trees, birdsong, fade away until all that's left is the echo of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from stalactites overhead. Cat stops suddenly and shines her light on a narrow passage leading off to the right. "That one hasn't been fully mapped yet," she says casually, before continuing straight ahead. I glance at the dark opening as we pass it by, feeling a strange pull in my gut like something is waiting for me down there. By the time we finish our tour and head back to the surface, my nerves are shot, but my curiosity is stronger than ever. There's something about this place that feels alive, not just alive, but watching. As Cat walks off without another word, Greg approaches me with his camera slung over his shoulder and a tired smile on his face. "Welcome to Mammoth Cave," he says quietly, his voice tinged with exhaustion. I nod, but don't respond right away. My eyes drift back toward the entrance of the cave as if it's calling me again. Thomas begins his first exploration of the cave system, feeling uneasy but resolute. The summer of 1969 had brought record numbers of tourists to Mammoth Cave. People were fascinated by the moon landing, and it seemed like everyone wanted to explore the unknown, whether it was outer space or the depths of the earth. For me, the cave felt more like a trap than an adventure. I spent my first week getting used to the routines. Every morning, Kat would assign me tasks, checking trail markers, inspecting equipment, or guiding small groups through the safer passages. She didn't trust me with anything too complicated yet, which suited me just fine. I wasn't ready to go deeper. The cave system is massive, over 300 miles of mapped passages with countless others still unexplored. Some chambers are so big they feel like underground cathedrals, while others are so tight you have to crawl on your stomach to get through. The limestone walls are smooth in some places and jagged in others, shaped by water over thousands of years. But it's not just the size that makes Mammoth Cave dangerous. There are pockets of toxic gas that can knock you out if you're not careful. Flooding is a constant risk, especially during heavy rains, and the acoustics underground can mess with your sense of direction. Echoes bounce off the walls in strange ways, making it hard to tell where sounds are coming from. Radio equipment doesn't work down there either. Once you're underground, you're completely cut off from the outside world. If something goes wrong, you're on your own. Victor Donovan told me that several hippie commune members had gone missing in the area recently. He said they'd come here looking for spiritual enlightenment or something like that, but never made it out of the caves. The local papers blamed it on poor planning, no maps, no proper gear, but Victor wasn't convinced. "There's more to this place than meets the eye," he said one afternoon as we sat outside the visitor center. He handed me a faded newspaper clipping about a group of spelunkers who disappeared in 1939. People have been vanishing here for over a century. I didn't know what to make of Victor's stories. He had a way of talking that made everything sound like a conspiracy theory, but there was something unsettling about his tone, like he knew more than he was letting on. Greg wasn't doing well either. His skin looked almost translucent now, and he'd started wearing sunglasses even indoors because his eyes were sensitive to light. He brushed it off when I asked about it, saying it was just a bad case of fatigue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, as I was finishing up my shift, Kat approached me with a grim look on her face. 3 tourists didn't come back from their guided tour, she said quietly. What happened? I asked. We don't know yet, she replied. Their guide found their equipment near one of the deeper chambers, but no sign of them. I felt a chill run down my spine. Disappearances weren't unheard of in Mammoth Cave, but they were rare, and they usually involve people venturing off on their own without proper gear or guidance. Kat and I joined the search party early the next morning. We combed through every passage near where their equipment had been found, but came up empty-handed. The air in those chambers felt colder than usual, and our headlamps seemed dimmer somehow, as if the darkness was swallowing the light. When we returned to the surface hours later, everyone looked shaken. One of the rangers muttered something about hearing whispers in the cave when no one else was around. That night I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept drifting back to those missing tourists and the strange cold spots we'd encountered underground. I stared at my Zippo lighter for what felt like hours, flicking it open and closed until my hands started to ache. Something about this place wasn't right. Thomas decides to investigate deeper into the cave system despite warnings from Kat. The next few days were strange. It wasn't just the missing tourists weighing on everyone, it was something else. The whole park felt off. It started with the staff. People were complaining about not being able to sleep, saying they'd been having the same nightmare over and over. In the dream, they were trapped underground, buried alive, unable to move or breathe. I didn't want to admit it, but I'd been having the same dream too. Every time I woke up, I felt like I was still suffocating, even though I was in my bed. Then there was the fungus. It started growing in places where people had disappeared, bright orange and red patches clinging to the walls and floors of the cave. Kat said she'd never seen anything like it before. It looked almost alive, pulsing faintly when you shined a light on it. Victor was the only one who didn't seem surprised by any of this. He showed me more of his newspaper clippings, stories of farmers finding their livestock drained of blood, spelunkers hearing strange grinding sounds deep in the caves, and even reports of people vanishing without a trace as far back as the 1890s. This place has secrets, Victor said one evening as we sat outside the visitor center, secrets older than any of us. I wanted to dismiss him as a conspiracy theorist, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen or what I was starting to feel. Every time I went into the cave, it felt like time didn't work right down there. Hours would pass in what felt like minutes, or sometimes minutes would stretch into hours. My watch would stop working underground, and when I came back to the surface, it would show a completely different time than everyone else's. Kat found a journal from 1939 in one of the park's archives, a logbook from a ranger who'd gone missing that year. His last entry described hearing sounds deep in the cave that he couldn't explain, stone grinding against stone, he wrote, but with the rhythm of breath. I couldn't get those words out of my head. One afternoon, while mapping a new passage near an underground river, I stumbled across something that made me stop cold, a series of cave paintings on the walls. They were old, ancient even, and they depicted elongated humanoid figures with no eyes and long limbs reaching out towards smaller human shapes. I called Kat over to look at them, but she didn't say much. She just stared at them for a long time before muttering something under her breath about how they didn't match any known indigenous art styles. That night, Greg came to me looking worse than ever. His skin had taken on an unnatural sheen, almost like it was thinning out. He handed me his journal and told me he'd been documenting everything that had been happening to him, the nightmares, the sensitivity to light, and now, something else. I feel like there's something inside me, he said quietly. What do you mean? I asked. I don't know, he replied, shaking his head. It's like something that thinks. I didn't know what to say to him. He looked so scared, more scared than I'd ever seen anyone look before. The next morning, one of the farmers from a nearby property came into the visitor center looking pale and shaken. He said he'd found 3 of his cows dead in their pasture, completely drained of blood with no visible wounds except for tiny punctures near their necks. Victor pulled me aside after hearing this and showed me another clipping. This one from 1947 about similar incidents during a government survey of Mammoth Cave. According to Victor, there had been military experiments conducted here during World War II involving some kind of subterranean creature, but all records had been sealed afterward. I wanted to believe it was just folklore or paranoia, but deep down I knew better. Later that day, Kat told me she'd found something disturbing while exploring one of the deeper chambers, a collection of stone statues frozen in poses of terror. At first glance, they looked like normal cave formations, but when she got closer, she realized they were too perfect to be natural. One statue wasn't fully stone yet. It still had patches of flesh clinging to it, and when she tried to move it, it died instantly. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin staring at Greg's journal and flicking my Zippo lighter open and closed again and again, I realized something. Whatever was happening here wasn't random, it was deliberate. Something down there was watching us, and it wasn't human. Thomas finds a newly opened passage that seems to call to him. I wasn't sure what made me go back into the cave that night. Maybe it was the nightmares, or maybe it was Greg's journal, the way his words seemed to echo my own fears. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing at the entrance again, my helmet light cutting through the darkness as I stepped inside. The cave felt different this time. The air was colder, heavier, and carried a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. Every sound seemed louder, the crunch of my boots on the rocky floor, the drip of water from overhead. But at the same time there was a strange silence, like the cave was holding its breath. I followed the path we'd marked earlier in the week, but something pulled me toward that narrow passage Kat had pointed out during my first tour. It felt like it was waiting for me. As I squeezed through the tight opening, my headlamp flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The walls were slick with moisture, and the air grew colder with every step. My watch had stopped again, but I didn't care anymore. I just kept going. The passage opened into a large chamber that took my breath away. The walls were covered in more of those ancient paintings, elongated figures with no eyes and twisted limbs reaching out toward smaller human shapes. But this time, there was something else. A pile of bones in the center of the room. They weren't animal bones, they were human. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at them. Some of the bones looked fresh, still white and clean, but others were yellowed and brittle, like they'd been here for decades. That's when I heard it. The sound Victor had described in his clippings, stone grinding against stone, but with a rhythm that felt alive. It came from deeper within the chamber, echoing off the walls until it surrounded me completely. I turned slowly, shining my light toward the source of the noise, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall with long spindly limbs and translucent skin that showed its organs pulsing underneath. Its oversized jaw hung open slightly, revealing rows of jagged teeth that glistened in the dim light. It had no eyes, just smooth skin where they should have been, but it didn't need them. It moved with perfect precision, like it could see everything without looking. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd turned to stone as it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Then it stopped and tilted its head slightly as if studying me. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, minutes, hours. Time didn't exist anymore. Suddenly, it released a cloud of spores from its skin, a fine mist that hung in the air like smoke. My head started spinning almost immediately, and I felt like I was falling even though I hadn't moved. The chamber around me shifted and warped as hallucinations took over. The paintings on the walls seemed to come alive, their elongated figures reaching out toward me with twisted limbs. The grinding sound grew louder until it felt like it was inside my skull. Somehow, I managed to stumble backward into the passage and crawl out of the chamber. My headlamp flickered again before going out completely, leaving me in total darkness as I scrambled toward the surface. When I finally emerged from the cave hours later, or maybe days, I collapsed onto the ground outside, gasping for air. Kat found me there and dragged me back to my cabin without saying a word. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, not to her or anyone else. But I knew one thing for sure: whatever was down there wasn't just some ancient predator or freak of nature. It was something more, something intelligent. Thomas realizes the scale of danger as Greg's illness worsens and seismic activity traps them underground. The morning after I stumbled out of the cave, I woke to find Greg missing. His journal was still on the table where he'd left it, but there was no sign of him anywhere in the park. Kat and I searched his cabin, the visitor center, and even some of the nearby trails, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. That's when we heard the first tremor. It wasn't strong, just a faint rumble beneath our feet, but it was enough to send a chill through me. Kat looked at me, her face pale. "That's coming from the cave," she said. We weren't the only ones who noticed. Victor appeared out of nowhere, clutching a stack of old papers and muttering something about the cycle starting again. He refused to explain what he meant, but his expression said it all. He was terrified. By midday, another search party had gone into the cave to look for Greg and the missing tourists. They didn't come back. Hours later, one of the rangers stumbled out of the cave alone. His clothes were torn and his face was blank, completely catatonic. He couldn't speak or move on his own, so we carried him to the infirmary. When they checked him over, they found strange marks on his skin, tiny punctures like the ones on the farmer's livestock. Victor pulled me aside that evening and finally told me everything he knew. "This isn't just a cave," he said, his voice shaking. "It's a hunting ground." He explained that the creatures, what he called the Pale Dwellers, had been here for centuries, maybe longer. They hibernated for decades at a time, only waking when they needed to feed. The disappearances, the strange sounds, even the seismic activity, it was all connected to them. "They're not animals," Victor said. "They're something else, something older than us." I wanted to dismiss him as crazy, but after what I'd seen in that chamber, I couldn't. It all made too much sense. The paintings on the walls, the bones, Greg's transformation, it was all connected. That night, Kat and I decided to go back into the cave one last time. We couldn't leave Greg or anyone else down there with those things. Victor insisted on coming with us, saying he knew where to find their breeding chamber. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The air was freezing now, and our headlamps barely cut through the darkness. The strange fungus had spread everywhere, glowing faintly in shades of orange and red. It pulsed when we got close, almost like it was alive. Then we found them, the statues Kat had described. They were scattered throughout a large chamber, frozen in poses of terror. Some looked like they were screaming. Others had their hands raised as if trying to shield themselves from something. One statue still had patches of flesh clinging to it, proof that these weren't just rocks. Victor knelt beside one of them and whispered something under his breath that I couldn't hear. We pressed on until we reached what Victor called the heart of the cave, a massive underground room that felt more like a cathedral than anything else. The ceiling stretched so high that our lights couldn't reach it, and in the center of the room was a sight that made my stomach turn. Thousands of stone eggs arranged in neat rows. "This is where they breed," Victor said quietly. Before we could react, Greg appeared from one of the shadows, or at least what was left of him. His skin was almost completely translucent now, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. But there was still something human in his expression, something desperate. "They're inside me," he said in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "But I can still feel them." He told us that sound frequencies could hurt them, that certain harmonics disrupted their ability to move or think clearly. Then he looked at me with an expression that broke my heart. "Don't let them win," he said before collapsing to the ground. That's when Victor turned on us. "I told you this place has secrets," he said with a twisted smile, "and some secrets are worth protecting." Before we could stop him, he grabbed one of our headlamps and smashed it against the wall, plunging half the room into darkness. The grinding sound started again, louder this time, and I realized too late what he'd done. He'd called them. The Pale Dwellers emerged from every corner of the chamber, their translucent bodies glowing faintly as they moved toward us with terrifying precision. Kat screamed and started setting up explosives while I grabbed Greg's journal and tried to remember what he'd written about sound frequencies. Using some metal equipment from our packs, I managed to create a makeshift resonator, a crude device that emitted high-pitched tones when struck. The creatures froze immediately, their movements jerky and uncoordinated as if they were fighting against an invisible force. "Do it now," I shouted at Kat. She lit the fuse on her explosives and ran toward me just as Victor lunged at her from behind. The blast knocked us both off our feet as rocks rained down from above, sealing off most of the chamber and trapping Victor and Greg inside with those things. Kat and I barely made it out alive. Thomas decides to navigate his worst fear, a flooded passage to escape while realizing not everything is over yet. The explosion had sealed off most of the breeding chamber, but it also blocked our way out. The tremors were worse now, shaking the ground beneath us and sending loose rocks tumbling from the walls. Kat and I were trapped, and the only way out was through a flooded passage Victor had warned us about earlier. I stared at the narrow opening in the rock, my heart pounding. The water was murky and cold, rippling faintly as if something was moving beneath the surface. My chest tightened at the thought of squeezing through that dark, suffocating space. It felt like Vietnam all over again, like the tunnels were closing in on me. "We don't have a choice," Kat said, her voice trembling but firm. "If we stay here, we're dead." I nodded, swallowing hard as I tried to steady my breathing. She handed me a rope to tie around my waist so we wouldn't lose each other in the water. "Just keep moving forward," she said. "Don't stop." The passage was tighter than I expected. I had to crawl on my stomach to get through some parts, my helmet scraping against the rock above me. The water was icy cold, soaking through my clothes and making it harder to breathe. Every time I moved, the walls seemed to press closer, squeezing me like a vice. I couldn't stop thinking about the pale dweller, about their translucent bodies slipping through solid stone like it was water. What if they followed us? What if they were already here? Kat kept calling out behind me, her voice echoing faintly in the narrow tunnel. "Keep going, we're almost there." But her words sounded distant, like they were coming from somewhere far away. My head started spinning again, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was still moving or if I'd stopped completely. Then I felt it, a hand on my ankle. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I turned slowly to look behind me. The water rippled faintly, but there was nothing there. Just darkness stretching back into the tunnel. "Thomas," Kat shouted from ahead. "Move." Her voice snapped me out of it, and I forced myself forward again, crawling faster now despite the tight space and freezing water. My hands scraped against jagged rocks, leaving trails of blood that mixed with the murky water below. Finally, after what felt like hours, we emerged into a larger chamber where the water was shallow enough to stand. Kat pulled herself up onto a rocky ledge and reached down to help me out of the water. We were both shaking, partly from the cold and partly from fear, but we didn't stop moving. The exit wasn't far now. I could feel it in my gut. But as we climbed toward the surface, something shifted behind us, a faint grinding sound that sent chills down my spine. "They're coming," Kat whispered. I turned to see shadows moving in the darkness below, long limbs twisting unnaturally as they climbed toward us with terrifying speed. My headlamp flickered again, casting eerie flashes of light across their translucent bodies. "Run," I shouted. We scrambled up the rocky slope as fast as we could, slipping on wet stone and grabbing onto anything that would hold our weight. The grinding sound grew louder with every step, echoing off the walls until it felt like it was inside my head again. When we finally reached the surface, I collapsed onto the ground outside, gasping for air as sunlight hit my face for the first time in what felt like days. Kat was beside me, clutching her side where she'd scraped against a sharp rock during our climb. But even as we lay there in the safety of daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us from just beyond the shadows. Thomas reaches the surface alive, but realizes something isn't right. The sunlight felt wrong. It was warm and bright, but it didn't comfort me the way it should have. I sat there on the ground, soaked to the bone, staring back at the cave entrance. Kat was beside me, breathing hard, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Neither of us said anything for a long time. We were alive. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. The cave had taken something from us. Or maybe it had left something behind. I couldn't tell which. By the time the other rangers found us, Kat had started coughing, deep, rattling sounds that made her double over in pain. They rushed her to the hospital in town, but I knew it wouldn't help. She'd been too close to those things for too long. Whatever was inside the cave was inside her now. The park was shut down the next day. Government officials arrived in black SUVs, taking over the site and ordering everyone out. They didn't ask us any questions, not about the missing tourists, or Greg or Victor. They just poured concrete over the cave entrance and told us it was for public safety. Kat didn't make it through the week. She called me one night from her hospital bed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's growing," she said. "I can feel it." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she'd be okay, but I couldn't lie to her. Not after everything we'd seen. She hung up without saying goodbye. I tried to go back to my normal life after that, to put Mammoth Cave behind me, but it followed me everywhere I went. My skin started changing, small patches turning translucent where the pale dwellers had touched me during our escape. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I noticed how those patches shimmered faintly in the light, like they were alive. I became obsessed with sound frequencies after that, building crude audio equipment in my cabin and spending hours listening to recordings from the cave. The grinding noise haunted me, playing over and over in my head until I could almost feel it vibrating through my bones. The National Park Service transferred me to another park far away from Kentucky, but it didn't matter. Mammoth Cave wasn't done with me yet. Late one night, as I sat alone in my new cabin surrounded by wires and speakers, I heard something on one of my recordings, a faint whisper buried beneath the grinding noise. It wasn't just random static or interference, it was words, and they were answering me. I froze, staring at the speaker as chills ran down my spine. Slowly, I whispered back into the microphone, "Who are you?" The response came almost immediately. A low, guttural sound that sent shivers through every part of me. "We are here." That was weeks ago. Now I spend most of my nights listening to those whispers, trying to understand what they want or what they're waiting for. Back at Mammoth Cave, underground monitoring equipment has started picking up movement behind the concrete walls sealing off the entrance. The tremors are faint for now, just small shifts in the rock, but they're getting stronger every day. I don't know what's coming next, but I do know one thing. Mammoth Cave isn't just a place you visit and leave behind. It stays with you forever. My name is Michael Tallman. I'm a park ranger, and this is the story of how I came back to the land I once called home. A land I thought I had left behind forever. I'm half Navajo, but for most of my life, I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. 20 years ago, I left the reservation to escape poverty and the weight of tradition that felt too heavy for a young man to carry. I thought I could outrun it all, build a new life in the city, far away from the red sands and endless mesas of Arizona. But life has a funny way of pulling you back to where you started. After a failed marriage and a career that fell apart, I found myself with nowhere else to go. So when the job opened up as a park ranger near the Navajo Nation borderlands, I took it. It wasn't just any job. It was a chance to start over, even if it meant facing the ghosts of my past. I'm not the same man who left all those years ago. At 40, my temples are streaked with gray, and my body carries the scars of mistakes and lessons learned the hard way. But my eyes, they still see everything. That's what makes me good at my job, tracking, surviving in the wilderness, and knowing when something's not quite right. My grandfather taught me those skills when I was a boy, along with the old stories and traditions of our people. Back then, I didn't pay much attention to his teachings. Now, they're some of the only things keeping me grounded. When I returned, Joseph Begay was one of the first people to welcome me back. He's an elder in the tribe and used to be close friends with my grandfather. Joseph is wise in ways that go beyond words. He sees things most people don't. Then there's Officer Paul Yezi, a tribal cop who's not exactly thrilled about me being here. He thinks I'm an outsider now, someone who abandoned his roots. He's not wrong, but he doesn't know my story either. And then there's Dr. Rachel Winters, an anthropologist studying Navajo legends. She's smart and curious but skeptical about anything she can't explain with science. She came here to document stories about skinwalkers, the shape-shifting witches of Navajo lore, but she doesn't understand what she's walking into. As for me, there's one thing I never leave behind: a small medicine pouch my grandfather gave me before he died. It's supposed to protect me from harm, though I never believed in that kind of thing. For years, it sat in a drawer collecting dust. But lately, something made me start wearing it again. I didn't know it yet, but coming back here was going to change everything. For all of us. The land here feels alive. It's not just the wind that whistles through the canyons or the way the shadows stretch and twist across the mesas at sunset. It's something deeper, something you can't see but can feel in your bones. This place remembers everything that's ever happened here, and sometimes, it feels like it's trying to tell you something. It was autumn, 1976. The drought had been going on for months, and the land was dry as a bone. Rivers that once carved through the sandstone were now just cracked beds of dust. The drought had uncovered things that had been hidden for years: cave systems, old ceremonial sites, even petroglyphs carved into the rocks by ancient hands. Some of these places hadn't been seen by human eyes in centuries. The park I worked in bordered the Navajo Nation. It was a rugged, unforgiving stretch of wilderness, towering sandstone cliffs, narrow box canyons, and endless miles of scrubland. The kind of place where you could get lost and never be found. My job was to patrol the area, keep an eye out for hikers in trouble, and make sure no one wandered into places they weren't supposed to go. But lately, things had felt off. Animals were acting strange. Coyotes would stand on ridges, staring down at me like they were watching my every move. Birds flew in patterns that didn't make sense, circling in perfect shapes before disappearing into the horizon. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow. One afternoon, I was out on patrol in my Jeep Cherokee, a beat-up old thing that barely ran half the time. I was driving along a dirt trail when I spotted something unusual in the distance. Pulling over, I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the horizon. There it was, a cluster of petroglyphs carved into a rock face that had been underwater until recently. I climbed out of the Jeep and made my way toward them, my boots crunching against the dry earth. When I got closer, I could see that these carvings were unlike any I'd seen before. One stood out, a figure with an animal head devouring what looked like the sun. The sight sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. It felt wrong. I radioed back to base to report what I'd found, but all I got was static. That wasn't unusual out here. The canyons messed with radio signals, but it didn't make me feel any better. As I turned to head back to my Jeep, something caught my eye: tracks in the dirt. At first glance, they looked like coyote prints, but as I followed them, they changed shape. The paw prints stretched into something larger, something almost human. I stopped dead in my tracks and scanned the area around me. The land was silent, too silent. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I don't scare easily, but in that moment, I felt a deep unease settle over me. It was like the land itself was holding its breath. I hurried back to my Jeep and drove back to base as fast as that old clunker would take me. Whatever those tracks belonged to, it wasn't something I wanted to meet out here alone. That night, as I sat in my small cabin going over maps of the area, there was a knock at my door. It was Joseph Bigay. "You found something today," he said without preamble. "How'd you know?" I asked. Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside and sat down across from me at the table. "The land speaks," he said finally. "You just have to know how to listen." I told him about the petroglyphs and the tracks I'd found. His face grew serious as he listened. "You need to be careful," he said when I finished. "There are things out here older than any of us, things best left undisturbed." "What kind of things?" I asked. Joseph hesitated before answering. "You've heard of skinwalkers?" I nodded slowly. Everyone around here had heard stories about them, witches who could take on the form of animals by wearing their skins. But those were just stories, weren't they? Joseph leaned forward, his voice low and steady. They're not just stories. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was being superstitious, but something in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't joking. Whatever you saw today, he said, it's only the beginning. As Joseph left that night, his words stayed with me long after he'd gone, and deep down, I knew he was right. The first sign that something was really wrong came the next morning. I was out checking on a ranch near the edge of the park. The owner, Henry, had radioed in, saying something had happened to his cattle. His voice sounded shaken, almost frantic. When I pulled up to his property, Henry was waiting for me by the fence. He was an older man, tough as nails, but today he looked pale and scared. Without saying a word, he led me into the field where his cattle grazed. What I saw there made my stomach turn. One of his cows was lying on the ground, still alive but barely moving. Its body had been turned inside out. The skin and muscles were twisted, the organs exposed, but somehow it was still breathing. Its eyes rolled toward me, wide with pain and fear. I had to put down 3 others, Henry said quietly. This one, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I crouched down next to the animal, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were no signs of predators, no claw marks, no blood trails. It was like something had done this with surgical precision. Any tracks? I asked. Henry shook his head. Nothing. I told him I'd report it to the authorities, but deep down I knew they wouldn't have any answers. As I drove away from the ranch, I couldn't shake the image of that cow from my mind. Later that day, I heard about another strange incident, this time from a group of school children in town. They claimed they'd seen a man watching them from across the playground. At first glance, he looked normal enough, but when they got closer, they realized his face wasn't right. They said it looked stretched and wrong, like it didn't belong to him. The kids were scared out of their minds, and their teacher called Officer Yazzie to investigate. By the time Yazzie showed up, the man was gone. I tried to brush it off as some drifter passing through town, maybe someone who wasn't well, but something about the story stuck with me. That evening, as I patrolled near one of the newly uncovered cave systems, I found more tracks in the dirt. This time they started as human footprints, but changed halfway through into coyote prints, just like before. I followed them for a while until they disappeared into thin air. No trail leading away, no disturbance in the dirt, just gone. When I got back to my cabin that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying everything. The cattle at Henry's ranch, the children's story about the man with the wrong face, and those tracks that seemed impossible. The next day brought more strange reports. Joseph told me about families on the reservation who claimed they'd seen doppelganger copies of their loved ones appearing out of nowhere when those loved ones were miles away or even out of state. These copies didn't speak. They just stood there watching before disappearing without a trace. Rachel Winters came by later with some photographs she'd taken near one of the ceremonial sites she was studying. She pointed out a shadow in one of the pictures, a long distorted shape that didn't match anything in the landscape. "It doesn't make sense," she said, frowning at the photo. "There's nothing here that could cast a shadow like this." I didn't have any answers for her or for myself. By now, even my equipment was acting up. My radio cut out every time I got near certain areas in the park. My compass spun wildly when I tried to use it near one of the abandoned uranium test sites. And worst of all, I started losing time. One afternoon, I set out to check on a trailhead about 10 miles from base camp. The drive should have taken half an hour at most, but when I arrived and checked my watch, 4 hours had passed. I couldn't remember anything about those missing hours. Just flashes of driving through endless red rock and feeling like something was watching me from just beyond my headlights. Joseph came by again that night with more warnings. "There's something waking up," he said quietly, as we sat by my cabin's fire pit. "What do you mean?" I asked. He stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "The drought has uncovered things that should have stayed buried." I wanted to ask him more, wanted him to explain exactly what he meant. But before I could say anything else, he stood up and left without another word. As he walked away into the darkness, I felt that same heavy silence settle over everything, the kind that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you can't see anyone around you. And deep down, I knew Joseph was right again. By this point, I couldn't deny it anymore. Something unnatural was happening out here. The land wasn't just alive, it felt like it was waking up, and whatever was stirring wasn't friendly. The next few days brought more signs, each one worse than the last. A group of tourists got lost in the desert and were found wandering miles away from where they should have been. When we found them, they were speaking in a language no one could understand. Their faces were sunburned and cracked from the heat, and their eyes looked hollow, like something had drained the life out of them. They didn't survive long after we brought them back. Rachel, who had been skeptical of all the stories at first, started to change her tune after she fell violently ill. It happened right after she photographed a set of petroglyphs near one of the caves. She said she felt fine one moment, and then suddenly couldn't breathe. Her face turned pale, and her body shook like she'd been hit with a fever. She recovered after a few days, but she wouldn't go near those caves again. Then there was Yazzie. He'd been investigating the disappearance of a teenager from the reservation, a boy who'd gone missing while walking home one evening. When Yazzie came back from his search, something about him was off. He wouldn't talk to anyone, not even me, and when I looked into his eyes under the dim light of his patrol car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His eyes reflected yellow. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but Joseph noticed it too. "He's been touched," Joseph said quietly when Yazzie wasn't around. "Touched by what?" I asked. Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed me a small pouch filled with white ash. "Keep this with you," he said, "and don't let him get too close." I started carrying my grandfather's medicine pouch everywhere. After that, I didn't know if it would actually protect me, but it felt like the only thing standing between me and whatever was creeping closer. One night, I went back out to the petroglyph site where Rachel had fallen ill. I don't know why, I guess I wanted answers. The carvings on the rocks seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight, and as I stood there staring at them, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. That's when I saw it. At first it looked like a coyote standing on a ridge about 50 yards away, but as I watched, its body began to change. It stretched upward until it stood on two legs like a man. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky to be human, and its eyes, they burned yellow in the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the creature tilted its head toward me. Then it let out a low growl that sounded almost like laughter before disappearing into the shadows. I ran back to my Jeep as fast as I could and didn't stop until I was back at base camp. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow eyes staring back at me. The next morning, Joseph came by again. He sat down across from me at my table and said something that made my stomach drop. "There's more than one." "What do you mean?" I asked. "They're family," he said quietly. "A group of them skinwalkers who've been here for generations. How do we stop them?" I asked. Joseph shook his head slowly. "You can't kill them. Not easily anyway, but you can weaken them." He explained that skinwalkers were bound by certain rules. They couldn't cross running water or enter homes without being invited in. They were also vulnerable to obsidian blades and white ash if used properly in ceremonies. "But they're clever," Joseph warned me. "They'll try to trick you, make you doubt yourself, or turn against the people around you." I thought about Yazzie, about how distant he'd become since his search for that missing boy. Is there any way to save someone who's been touched? I asked hesitantly. Joseph didn't answer right away. He just looked at me with sad eyes before saying softly, "Sometimes." That night, as I sat alone in my cabin with Joseph's pouch of white ash clutched tightly in my hand, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. Whatever these things were, they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Things were spiraling out of control. Every day brought something worse than the last, and the tension in the air felt like a storm about to break. I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The first blow came when Officer Yazzie returned to base after disappearing for hours during another search for the missing boy. He was quiet, almost too quiet, and his movements seemed wrong. He didn't blink as much as he should have, and his voice had this strange echo to it, like it wasn't coming from him, but from somewhere else. When I tried talking to him, he just stared at me with those yellow reflecting eyes and said, "You don't belong here anymore." Then he walked away without another word. Joseph warned me to keep my distance, but it wasn't easy. Yazzie was still technically in charge of local law enforcement, and people were starting to notice that he wasn't acting like himself. The worst part was that no one knew how to stop him, or if he could even be saved. Then there were the tourists. 3 of them went missing after hiking near one of the uranium test sites. When we finally found them wandering through the desert, they weren't the same people anymore. Their skin was pale and clammy, their eyes sunken like they hadn't slept in days. They spoke in whispers words that didn't make sense, like they were trying to communicate but had forgotten how. All 3 of them died within hours of being found. The doctors said their organs had failed, but no one could explain why. Rachel wasn't doing much better. She'd been sick ever since her encounter with the petroglyphs, but now she was having nightmare visions of creatures with animal heads chasing her through endless canyons. She told me she felt like something was watching her all the time, even when she was alone. I tried to comfort her, but I wasn't sure I believed my own words anymore. Then came the worst incident yet. A child went missing from one of the nearby towns. The search party found her clothes arranged in a strange pattern near the edge of a cliff dwelling site, but there was no sign of the girl herself. Her parents were inconsolable, and the entire town was on edge. That night, Joseph performed a ceremony to try to get answers. He said he could feel multiple skinwalkers moving through the land, like shadows slipping between worlds. He also said they were growing stronger because of the drought and the disturbances caused by the uranium mining. They're feeding on fear, he told me as we sat by my cabin's fire pit. The more chaos they create, the more powerful they become. I asked him what we could do to stop them, but his answer didn't give me much hope. We need to weaken them, he said, but it will come at a cost. I didn't understand what he meant at first, but I would soon find out. The next day, Rachel and I decided to investigate one of the cliff dwelling sites where Joseph said he felt their presence strongest. We brought cameras and equipment to document whatever we found, though deep down I wasn't sure if we'd make it back alive. As we climbed into one of the caves, we found evidence of recent activity, ritualistic carvings on the walls and dried blood smeared across the rocks. Rachel took pictures while I kept watch with my rifle, every nerve in my body on high alert. That's when we heard it. A low growl echoing through the cave like something big was moving toward us. "Michael," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." I nodded and started backing toward the entrance. But before we could leave, something lunged at us from the shadows, a figure that was neither fully human nor fully animal. Its limbs twisted unnaturally as it moved, and its yellow eyes burned like fire. I fired my rifle without thinking, but it didn't seem to do much damage. The creature let out a deafening screech before disappearing into thin air. Rachel and I ran back to our Jeep as fast as we could and didn't stop until we were miles away from that cave. When we got back to base camp, Joseph was waiting for us. He looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen him, but his expression hardened when he saw how shaken we were. "They're preparing for something," he said grimly, "and if we don't stop them soon, it'll be too late." That night, as I sat alone in my cabin trying to make sense of everything that had happened, I realized there was no turning back now. Whatever these things wanted, they weren't going to stop until they got it. The tension had reached its breaking point. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Even the land itself seemed restless, like it knew what was coming. Joseph came to my cabin that morning with a grim look on his face. He told me the skinwalkers were preparing for a ritual, a powerful one that would make them even harder to stop. If we didn't act now, they'd be unstoppable. "They're gathering at the petroglyph site," he said, "tonight during the solar eclipse. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down, I knew he was right. The signs had been building for weeks. The strange tracks, the disappearances, the unnatural behavior of animals. It all pointed to something bigger than any of us could handle. Rachel insisted on coming with us. She said she wanted to document everything, but I could tell she was scared. We all were. Joseph handed me an obsidian blade before we left, a small, jagged knife that felt heavy in my hand despite its size. "This will hurt them," he said, "but it won't kill them unless you strike true." I nodded and tucked the blade into my belt alongside my grandfather's medicine pouch. I didn't know if either would be enough, but I wasn't about to go into this fight unprepared. We set out just before sunset in my Jeep Cherokee, which sputtered and groaned as we drove toward the petroglyph site. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing even though the sky was clear. When we arrived, the land was eerily quiet. The petroglyphs glowed faintly in the fading light, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Joseph led us toward a ridge overlooking the site, where we could see figures moving below, 4 of them, their bodies shifting between human and animal forms as they chanted in low voices that echoed through the canyon. "They're trying to open a wound in the earth," Joseph said quietly, "to draw power from what lies beneath." "What lies beneath?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he began preparing his own ritual, a counter-ceremony meant to weaken the skinwalkers and disrupt their plans. As Joseph worked, Rachel and I kept watch. The figures below moved with unnatural speed and precision, their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness as they performed their twisted ceremony. Then one of them looked up, straight at us. Before I could react, Yazi appeared behind us out of nowhere. His face was twisted into something unrecognizable, his eyes burning yellow as he lunged toward me. I barely managed to draw the obsidian blade in time. The knife cut deep into Yazi's arm, and he let out a scream that sounded more animal than human before stumbling backward. But he didn't stop. He came at me again, faster this time, his movements jerky and unnatural. I had no choice. I drove the blade into his chest, and he collapsed to the ground with a final gasp. I stared at his lifeless body in shock as Joseph continued his ceremony, chanting words I didn't understand but felt deep in my soul. Rachel screamed behind me as one of the skinwalkers climbed onto the ridge, its body shifting between forms as it lunged toward her. She fought back with everything she had, but it was clear she couldn't hold it off for long. I grabbed my rifle and fired at the creature's legs, slowing it down just enough for Rachel to escape its grasp. Then Joseph's chanting reached a crescendo, and the air around us seemed to vibrate with energy. The skinwalkers below let out deafening screeches as Joseph's ceremony took effect. Their bodies flickered like shadows caught in a storm before collapsing to the ground one by one. But it wasn't over yet. The largest of them, the leader, rose from the ground and turned its yellow eyes toward me. It spoke in a voice that wasn't human but somehow familiar. "You can't stop us," it said. "Your bloodline belongs to us." I realized then what Joseph had meant when he said there would be a cost. These creatures weren't just after power. They were after me specifically because of my grandfather's role in trapping them decades ago. The leader lunged toward me faster than I could react, knocking me to the ground and pinning me beneath its weight. Its breath burned against my face as it whispered words that made my head spin. But then I remembered Joseph's advice, strike true. With every ounce of strength I had left, I drove the obsidian blade into its chest, right where its heart should have been, and watched as its body flickered and dissolved into ash. The solar eclipse ended just as the last of them fell silent, leaving only darkness behind. Joseph collapsed beside me, his energy spent from performing the ceremony. He looked up at me with tired eyes and said softly, "It's done for now." Rachel helped me back to my feet as we surveyed the damage around us. The petroglyph site was quiet again, too quiet, but we knew better than to think this was truly over. As we drove back to base camp that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just in the land but in me too. And deep down, I knew this wasn't really an ending. It was just another beginning. The land was quiet again, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the silence after a storm, when the damage is done but you know it's not over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Joseph didn't make it through the night. The ceremony had taken too much out of him, and by morning he was gone. I buried him near the ridge where he'd fought so hard to protect us. As I stood over his grave, I couldn't help but feel like I'd lost more than just a friend. Joseph had been the last link to my grandfather's wisdom, the last person who truly understood what we were up against. Rachel stayed for a few more days trying to piece together what had happened. She documented everything, the petroglyphs, the cave systems, the strange behavior of the animals, but when she tried to review her footage, most of it was corrupted. The shadows in her photos seemed to move on their own, and the audio recordings were filled with static and whispers she couldn't explain. Then the government showed up. They didn't come in with flashing lights or loud announcements. They came quietly, in unmarked vehicles, asking questions that felt more like accusations. They confiscated Rachel's research and told her she wasn't allowed to share any of it with anyone, not even me. One of them pulled me aside and offered me a promotion, a cushy desk job far away from here. "You've been through enough," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let us handle this." I didn't take the offer. I couldn't leave, not after everything that had happened. This land wasn't just my responsibility anymore, it was part of me now. I moved into a small house on the reservation and started teaching young rangers about traditional protections, the kind Joseph had taught me when I was a boy. I told them about the medicine pouch and the white ash, about how to listen to the land when it tries to warn you. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't escape what had happened. Every night I dreamed about those yellow eyes staring back at me, about Yazi's twisted face and the way the leader's voice echoed in my head. Sometimes, when I'm out patrolling alone, I catch glimpses of movement in the distance, shadows that don't belong to anything real. And once, during a full moon, I looked into a puddle of water and saw something that made my blood run cold. My eyes reflected yellow. I don't know what it means yet, if part of them stayed with me or if they're still trying to get inside my head, but I know one thing for sure: this isn't over. As I sit by the fire teaching new rangers how to protect themselves, I scan the horizon for signs of movement, for anything that feels out of place. The land is alive again, and it remembers everything, and so do I. My name is Dr. Nathan Russell. I'm a forest ecologist and a senior park ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington. If you're expecting a heroic introduction, I'll disappoint you. I'm not the kind of guy who saves the day or gets the girl. I'm just a man who spends his days studying plants, writing theories no one believes, and walking through forests that most people never think about. For as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with the idea that plants aren't just living things, they're connected, like a giant brain spread across the earth. My colleagues laugh at me for saying things like that. They call me Dr. Tree Whisperer behind my back. It doesn't bother me anymore. I've gotten used to being the odd one out. My work cost me my marriage, though. My ex-wife said I cared more about moss than her, and maybe she was right. I'm not much to look at either. Thin, scruffy beard, dark circles under my eyes from too many sleepless nights reading research papers. People say my movements are quick and bird-like I'm always in a hurry to get somewhere but don't know where that is. The one thing I do care about besides plants is my journal. For 15 years, I've written in it every day, recording everything I see in the park, changes in plant growth, animal behavior, even the weather patterns. It's filled with pressed leaves and flowers from every corner of the forest. It's my life's work, and if anything ever happened to it, well, let's just say I wouldn't handle it well. I work with a small team at the park. There's Marcus Wilson, my boss and park supervisor. He's a practical guy who doesn't believe in my theories but respects my dedication to the job. Then there's Dr. Linda Hammond, a visiting scientist studying fungal networks in the park. She's smart, curious, and surprisingly interested in my ideas about plant consciousness, though she hasn't said whether she believes them yet. And finally, there's Peter Gonzalez, a new transfer who's eager to learn from me despite everyone warning him that I'm a little out there. It was November 1983 when things started to change. The fog rolled in one morning and didn't leave. At first, we thought it was normal. Fog isn't unusual here, but after 27 days of thick mist that refused to clear, even Marcus started getting worried. The fog wasn't just eerie, it was dangerous. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, making patrols treacherous. The cold seeped into your bones no matter how many layers you wore, and the roots and rocks hidden beneath the mist made every step risky. But for me, for someone who spent his life studying nature, the fog felt alive. The fog wasn't just a blanket over the forest, it was like it had its own mind. It moved strangely, swirling in ways that didn't match the wind. Sometimes it would hang low to the ground, thick and heavy, and other times it would rise up, clinging to the tops of the trees like a second canopy. It was everywhere, and it made everything feel off. Olympic National Park is a place of extremes. The trees here are giants, some over 1,000 years old. The ground is covered in thick moss, ferns, and fallen logs that have been rotting for centuries. The air smells damp and earthy, like life and decay all mixed together. Normally, it's beautiful, a place that feels untouched by time. But with the fog, it felt different. It felt wrong. We were supposed to be closing the park for the season. November isn't exactly prime hiking weather, and most visitors had already left. But there were still a few stragglers, hikers who thought they could handle the cold and rain, or photographers trying to capture the misty landscapes. Marcus told us to keep an eye out for anyone who might get lost in the fog. The strange thing was how quiet it had gotten. Usually the forest is full of sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling, streams bubbling, but now it was like someone had turned the volume down. Even the animals seemed to be hiding. The silence made every little noise stand out, the crunch of boots on wet ground, the snap of a twig, the distant drip of water falling from a tree branch. I remember one patrol in particular. Peter and I were checking one of the trails near Lake Crescent. He was still new to the job and full of questions about everything. What kind of tree is this? What's that bird call? How do you know which mushrooms are poisonous? I didn't mind answering. His enthusiasm reminded me of when I first started, but then we found something strange. A set of tools, a hammer, a saw, and a wrench, lying in the middle of the trail. They were old, rusted over like they'd been sitting there for decades. Peter picked up the hammer and turned it over in his hands. "Who do you think left these here?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. There hadn't been any logging in this area for nearly 50 years, and even then they wouldn't have just left their tools behind like this. We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following us, but there was nothing there, just fog. That night, back at the ranger station, Linda showed me something she'd found during her research. Mushrooms growing in perfectly straight lines across one of her study plots. She said it wasn't natural, that fungi don't grow like that on their own. It's almost like they're being guided, she said. Guided by what? I asked. She didn't have an answer either. The first real sign that something was wrong came a few days later. A maintenance crew had gone out to repair a broken bridge on one of the trails. When they came back, they looked shaken. One of the workers, a guy named Dave, kept rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm them up, even though we were all inside by the heater. "What happened out there?" Marcus asked. Dave hesitated, then said, "Our tools, they disappeared." "What do you mean disappeared?" Marcus frowned. "We set them down for a minute, just a minute, and when we turned around, they were gone. We thought maybe we'd dropped them or something. But then," he trailed off and looked at the other workers for support. "Then what?" Marcus pressed. "They came back," Dave said quietly, "but not where we left them. They were stuck in the trees. The hammer was jammed into the trunk of a cedar, and the saw was hanging from a branch like someone had wedged it there." Marcus laughed nervously. "You're telling me trees are stealing tools now?" "I'm telling you what I saw," Dave said firmly. "You can believe me or not." I believed him. I didn't say anything, but I believed him. The next day I decided to check one of my research plots. It was a small clearing where I'd been monitoring plant growth for years. When I got there, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The plants had grown 3 times their normal size in just a few weeks. Ferns that should have been knee-high were taller than me. Vines twisted around tree trunks like they were alive, reaching toward the sky. But it wasn't just the size that bothered me, it was the way they looked. The leaves were darker than normal, almost black in some places, and some of the plants had strange bumps and ridges that I'd never seen before. It was like they were mutating. I took out my camera and started snapping pictures for my journal when I heard something. A faint whispering sound coming from deeper in the forest. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like voices. "Hello?" I called out, even though I knew no one else should have been out there. The whispering stopped. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence before finally heading back to the station. That night, Linda showed me footage from one of her wildlife cameras. She'd set it up to monitor fungal growth in another part of the park. The video showed fog moving through the trees, but not in a natural way. It wasn't drifting or swirling like normal fog would. It was moving in tendrils, almost like it was alive. "Have you ever seen fog do that before?" she asked me. "No," I admitted. Neither of us slept much that night. The next morning, Peter found something while patrolling one of the older trails, a cache of equipment buried under a fallen log. It looked like it had been there for decades, an old backpack, a rusted compass, and a journal wrapped in plastic to keep it dry. Peter brought the journal back to show me. The pages were yellowed with age, but most of the writing was still legible. It belonged to a ranger who had worked here in the 1930s, a man named Henry Carter who had disappeared without a trace in 1937. Most of his entries were normal, notes about trail conditions and wildlife sightings, but near the end his writing became frantic and disjointed. He wrote about seeing figures in the mist, humanoid shapes that seemed to watch him from a distance but vanished whenever he got too close. "They're not human." One entry read, "They're part of this place, part of the forest itself." I closed the journal and looked at Peter. "Where did you find this?" "Near the old logging road," he said. "Why?" I didn't answer him because I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling, a sense of dread that was growing stronger by the day. The whispers in the forest didn't stop. If anything, they got louder. Visitors who managed to make it out of the park started reporting strange things, hearing voices that sounded like their loved ones calling to them from deep in the woods, seeing shapes moving in the fog that vanished when they got closer. Some even said they felt like they were being followed, but when they turned around, no one was there. Linda and I spent more time together trying to figure out what was going on. She was focused on her fungal samples, which were showing bizarre results. Under the microscope, the fungal structures looked like nerves, tiny filaments branching out and connecting in ways that resembled a brain. She called it quasi-neural activity, but to me, it looked like something alive was using the fungi to communicate. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Linda showed me a sample she'd taken from one of the mushrooms growing in a straight line near her study site. It glowed faintly in the dark, a soft green light that pulsed like a heartbeat. "It's bioluminescent," she said. "I've never seen anything like it." "What does it mean?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know, but whatever this is, it's not natural." The next day we found something even stranger. A massive tree near one of the trails had been stripped of its bark in patches, revealing smooth wood underneath. The patches formed a pattern roughly circular with jagged edges that almost looked like a face. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but when we came back later that afternoon, the face had shifted. The eyes were wider now, and the mouth seemed to be open, as if it were screaming. Peter joked that it was probably just some prankster messing with us, but I could tell he didn't really believe that. None of us did. That evening, we set up motion-activated cameras around the tree to see if we could catch anyone or anything tampering with it. The next morning, we checked the footage and saw nothing unusual at first, just fog drifting through the trees as usual. But then something happened that made my stomach drop. The fog started moving against the wind, swirling around the base of the tree in long tendrils. Slowly, those tendrils began to take shape, forming what looked like arms and legs made of mist and fungal filaments. The figure stood there for a moment before dissolving back into the fog. We watched the video over and over again in silence. "What are we dealing with here?" Peter finally asked. I didn't have an answer. Later that day, I went back to my research plot alone. I needed time to think, to figure out if there was some logical explanation for everything we'd been seeing. But as I stood there among the overgrown plants and mutated vines, I felt something brush against my arm. I turned around quickly but saw nothing, just fog creeping through the undergrowth. And then I heard it, a voice whispering my name. "Nathan." It sounded faint and distant at first, but then it grew louder until it was all around me. "Nathan." I ran back to the station as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. When I told Linda what had happened, she didn't look surprised. "They're trying to communicate," she said quietly. "Who?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "The fog shepherds," that's what she called them. The figures we'd seen in the mist. She believed they were some kind of composite organism made up of fungal networks and plant life, a collective intelligence that had been part of this forest for centuries. They weren't just creatures, they were part of the ecosystem itself. "They're not hunting us," she said. "At least, not yet." "What do you mean, not yet?" I asked. "They're studying us," she said. "Learning about us." "And then what?" She didn't answer. Things started to spiral after that. The fog felt like it was closing in on us. Tighter and tighter every day. It wasn't just a weather pattern anymore, it was something alive, something that wanted us to know it was there. Peter was the first to go missing. He'd gone out on a routine patrol near the old logging road. When he didn't check in after a few hours, Marcus sent me and Linda to look for him. We followed his usual route, calling his name, but the fog swallowed our voices before they could travel far. It was like yelling into a pillow. Then we found them, his boots. They were sitting neatly in the middle of the trail, side by side. At first, I thought he'd taken them off for some reason, but when I got closer, I realized they weren't empty. His feet were still inside them. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. Linda turned pale but didn't say anything. We searched the area for hours, but there was no sign of Peter. No blood, no tracks leading away from the boots. It was like he'd just vanished. When we got back to the station and told Marcus what we'd found, he refused to believe us. "People don't just disappear," he said angrily. "You must have missed something." "We didn't miss anything," Linda said firmly. "The fog took him." Marcus scoffed. "The fog, are you hearing yourself right now?" But even as he argued with us, I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew something was wrong, he just didn't want to admit it. That night, Linda showed me something else she'd found in her lab. One of her fungal samples had started growing human cells, skin cells to be exact. She didn't know how it was possible, but there they were under the microscope. Tiny patches of human tissue spreading through the fungal network like a disease. "It's integrating," she said quietly. "Whatever this thing is, it's absorbing people into itself." I thought about Peter's boots and felt sick all over again. The next morning, Marcus insisted on keeping the park open despite everything that had happened. He said we couldn't afford to close it down without a good reason, without proof that something dangerous was going on. Later that day, I found him standing alone in the middle of a clearing, talking to thin air. "Marcus?" I called out. He turned to look at me, his face blank and distant. "They just want to understand," he said softly. "Who?" I asked, stepping closer. "The shepherds," he whispered. I grabbed his arm and pulled him back toward the station. He didn't resist, but he kept mumbling under his breath about how they mean no harm and we're all part of the same system. That night, things got worse. Visitors who hadn't left yet started reporting strange sightings, shapes moving in the fog that looked like their friends or family members calling out to them from deep in the woods. One man swore he saw his wife waving at him even though she'd been dead for years. Linda found her research notes scattered across her desk with new entries written in handwriting that wasn't hers. The notes described experiments she hadn't conducted and results she hadn't observed, but they were written as if she had. And then there was me. I started noticing small patches of moss growing on my skin, on my hands and arms at first, then spreading to my chest and neck. I tried scrubbing it off in the shower, but it always came back stronger than before. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even Linda. I didn't want them to know how far this thing had gotten inside me. The final straw came when Linda analyzed a sample of the fog itself under her microscope. It wasn't just water vapor, it was teeming with organic material, fungal spores, plant cells, and human DNA. "It's us," she said quietly. "The fog is made of us." That night, as we sat together in the station trying to figure out what to do next, the radios crackled to life on their own. At first it was just static, but then we heard voices coming through, Peter's voice reciting botanical classifications from my journal, Marcus's voice whispering about the shepherds, and finally my own voice saying things I'd never said before. "They're waiting," my voice said over the radio. "They're ready." Linda looked at me with wide eyes. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," I whispered. But deep down, I think I did. The fog was everywhere now, pressing against the windows of the visitor center like it was trying to get inside. Marcus had locked himself in his office, muttering to someone, or something that wasn't there. Linda and I were the only ones left who hadn't completely lost it. At least I hoped we hadn't. "We can't stay here," Linda said, pacing back and forth. "It's not safe." "Where would we go?" I asked. "The fog's got the whole park surrounded." She stopped pacing and looked at me. "There's one place it hasn't touched yet, the old grove." I knew the place she was talking about, a cluster of ancient trees deep in the forest, older than anything else in the park. I'd always felt drawn to it, like it was special somehow. But going there now, it felt like walking straight into the lion's den. "You think that's where they are?" I asked. She nodded. "If there's a core to this thing, if there's something controlling it, it'll be there." I didn't like the idea, but what choice did we have? We couldn't just sit around waiting for the fog to take us. We packed what little gear we had left, flashlights, a map, and Linda's experimental compound she'd been working on in secret. She said it might disrupt the fungal networks, but she wasn't sure if it would work. Before we left, I grabbed my journal. I didn't know why. It felt like a lifeline somehow, like it might help me understand what was happening. The hike to the grove was slow and tense. The fog followed us every step of the way, swirling around our feet and brushing against our faces like cold fingers. Every so often, I thought I saw shapes moving in the mist, figures that looked almost human but weren't. "Nathan," a voice whispered from somewhere behind me. I froze. It sounded like Peter. "Don't stop," Linda said sharply. "Keep moving." I forced myself to keep walking, even as the whispers grew louder and closer. When we finally reached the grove, the fog seemed to pull back slightly, as if it were afraid of the trees. The air felt heavy and still, like we'd stepped into another world entirely. In the center of the grove stood the oldest tree I'd ever seen, a massive cedar with a trunk, so wide it would take 10 people holding hands to circle it. Its bark was covered in patches of moss and fungi that glowed faintly in the darkness. "This is it," Linda said quietly. As we approached the tree, I felt something strange, a pull deep inside me, like my body was being drawn toward it against my will. My skin tingled where the moss patches had started growing, and for a moment, I thought I could hear voices coming from inside the tree itself. Linda set up her compound near one of the glowing patches on the trunk. She worked quickly but carefully, her hands steady despite everything that was happening. "They're watching us," she said without looking up. I turned around and saw them, figures made of mist and fungal filaments standing at the edge of the grove, their root-like limbs stretched out toward us, their glowing spores pulsing softly in time with our movements. "They don't want us here," I said. "They don't get a choice," Linda replied firmly. She activated her compound, spraying it directly onto the glowing patch of fungi. For a moment, nothing happened, but then the tree let out a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a deep groan that vibrated through my chest like thunder. The fog surged forward all at once, wrapping around us in thick tendrils that pulled at our clothes and skin. The figures moved closer too, their shapes solidifying into something almost human but not quite. They're reacting, Linda shouted over the noise. Keep them back. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at one of the figures as it reached for me. The branch passed straight through its body like smoke, but when I held up my flashlight and shined it directly on its face, it recoiled as if burned by the light. Light, I yelled to Linda. They don't like light. She grabbed her flashlight and pointed it at another figure, forcing it back toward the edge of the grove. But there were too many of them, more than we could count, and they were closing in fast. I have to finish this, Linda shouted as she sprayed more of her compound onto the tree. But then something happened that neither of us expected. The tree began to glow brighter than ever before, its light spreading out through the grove like ripples in water. The figures froze in place as if stunned by what was happening. And then I understood. I wasn't just fighting them, I was part of them. The moss on my skin wasn't an infection. It was a connection to something bigger than myself. They're not trying to hurt us, I said suddenly. They're trying to communicate. Linda looked at me like I'd lost my mind. What are you talking about? I can feel them, I said quietly. They're part of this forest, and now so am I. Before she could stop me, I stepped forward and placed my hand on the glowing patch of fungi on the tree's trunk. The moment my skin touched it, everything went white, like someone had flipped a switch inside my head. I saw everything. The history of this forest, its struggles against human destruction, its desire to survive no matter what. And then I saw myself, not as an individual, but as part of something greater, a network that connected every living thing in this park. When I opened my eyes again, Linda was staring at me with tears in her eyes. What did you do? She whispered. I gave them what they wanted, I said softly. A way to understand. The figures dissolved into mist once more, retreating into the trees as if satisfied with what they'd learned. The fog began to lift slowly but surely, until only sunlight remained filtering through the canopy above us. When the fog finally cleared, it felt like the forest had exhaled. The air was lighter, the silence less oppressive. Linda and I stood there in the grove, staring at the ancient cedar tree. It wasn't glowing anymore, but I could still feel its presence, like it was watching us. What happens now? Linda asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer her. The fog shepherds were gone, but I could still feel them, like they were part of me now, woven into my thoughts and memories. I wasn't sure if that feeling would ever go away. We made our way back to the visitor center in silence. Marcus was still locked in his office, but when we knocked on the door, he didn't respond. Linda pushed it open carefully, and we found him sitting at his desk, staring out the window at the trees. He looked calm, almost peaceful, but there was something strange about him, something off. He was holding a small jar filled with water and moss, gently tipping it toward one of the potted plants on his desk. They need to be fed, he said softly, without looking at us. Linda glanced at me nervously. Marcus, are you okay? He smiled faintly, but didn't answer. I wasn't sure if he'd ever be okay again. The park reopened in the spring, just like Marcus insisted. Officially, there was no explanation for Peter's disappearance or the strange events that had taken place during the fog. Linda tried to share her findings with other scientists, but government officials showed up and confiscated her research before she could publish anything. They called it classified and warned her not to pursue it further. I stayed on as a ranger, but things were never quite the same after that. Visitors began reporting odd sensations while hiking through certain parts of the park, feelings of being watched or hearing faint whispers coming from nowhere. Some said they saw faces in the bark of trees or shapes moving in the mist, even on clear days. The plants grew faster than ever before, spreading into areas they hadn't touched in decades. Some of them had strange properties, leaves that glowed faintly at night, or flowers that seemed to turn toward people as they walked by. Marcus stayed too, though he changed in ways I couldn't explain. He spent more time alone in the forest, tending to specific trees as if they were his children. Sometimes I'd catch him talking to them under his breath, his hands pressed against their trunks like he was listening for a response. Linda left eventually. She said she couldn't stay after everything that had happened. It was too much for her. Before she left, she told me she'd never forget what we'd seen in the grove. "They're still here," she said quietly as she packed up her car. "You know that, don't you?" I nodded, but didn't say anything. The final scene came months later when a tourist family stopped by the visitor center before heading out on one of the trails. They were cheerful and excited, snapping photos of everything: the trees, the wildlife, even me standing by my desk. As they posed for a group photo near one of the old trails, I saw it, a brief flicker in the mist behind them, a face made of fog and light that looked eerily familiar. It was mine. The family didn't notice it. They were too busy smiling for their camera. But as they walked away down the trail, their young daughter turned back and looked at me with wide eyes. "Do you hear it too?" she asked softly. "Hear what?" I asked. "The forest," she said simply. "Hear what?" I asked. "The forest," she said simply. I watched her walk away with her family, feeling a chill run down my spine. She was right. The forest was talking now, and somehow I knew it always would. My name is Diana Morgan. I used to be an FBI agent, a profiler who hunted the worst kinds of criminals, serial killers, kidnappers, people who did unspeakable things. I thought I was good at it, maybe even the best. But I made a mistake, a big one. It cost me my career, my reputation, and someone I cared about deeply. Now, I live in the Adirondack Mountains in New York, working as a park ranger. It's quiet here, far from the noise of the city and the media that tore me apart after that mistake. I tell myself I chose this life, but deep down I know I'm hiding from people, from memories, from myself. I work with a small team at the ranger station. Chief Walter Peterson is my boss. He's been doing this job for decades and is close to retiring. He doesn't ask too many questions about my past, but I can tell he wonders why someone like me ended up here. Then there's Dr. Max Hoffman, a wildlife biologist who's always talking about predator behavior and ecosystems. He's smart but strange. He has theories about animals that sound more like ghost stories than science. And Jamie Winters is just a kid, 16 years old, but he knows these woods better than anyone. He works part-time at the station and dreams of becoming a full-time ranger one day. The Adirondacks are beautiful but dangerous. The forests are thick and endless, filled with lakes and rocky cliffs that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. It's October now, unusually warm for this time of year, a weird Indian summer that's messing with the wildlife patterns. Hunters are out in full force, which means we have to keep an eye on them and make sure no one gets hurt or lost. At first, everything seemed normal, until the reports started coming in. Hunters began complaining about their equipment being sabotaged, rifles jammed, tents slashed. Some said they felt like they were being watched or followed through the woods. I didn't think much of it until I saw something myself. It was a deer carcass on one of the trails, not just dead but mutilated. Its organs were gone, and what was left had been arranged in a spiral pattern on the ground. It wasn't random. Someone or something had done this deliberately. I stood there staring at it for what felt like forever before calling it in to Walter. My gut told me this wasn't just some prank or animal attack. Something was wrong in these woods. The Adirondacks are massive, over 6 million acres of forest, mountains, and lakes. It's easy to get lost out here. Even with a map or GPS, the terrain can turn you around if you're not paying attention. And in October, the weather can change in minutes. One moment it's warm and sunny, the next a cold wind sweeps through and the temperature drops like a stone. I've always loved the quiet out here. It's one of the reasons I stayed, but lately, the quiet feels different. Heavier, like the forest is holding its breath. After finding that deer carcass, I started paying closer attention on my patrols. I noticed little things, birds going silent when they shouldn't, tracks that didn't make sense. Max said it could be because of the warm weather messing with animal behavior, but I wasn't so sure. Then more reports came in. A group of hunters claimed their gear had been destroyed overnight, ripped apart like someone had taken a knife to it. Another group swore they saw glowing red eyes watching them from the trees but couldn't find any tracks when they looked. One man even said he heard his own voice calling his name from deep in the woods. Walter brushed most of it off as campfire stories or hunters spooking themselves. But Jamie, young as he is, told me something that stuck with me. Locals say there's a part of the forest no one goes into, he said one evening while we were closing up the station. They call it the dead zone. Animals avoid it too. My grandpa used to say it was cursed. I laughed it off at first, but Jamie wasn't joking. I'm serious, he said. People have gone missing there. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt uneasy after that conversation. When I looked at the map later that night, I realized something strange. All the incidents, the sabotaged gear, the strange sightings, they were happening near a specific area of the forest. A 30-square-mile stretch that wasn't marked on any official trail maps. The next morning, Max came into the station looking rattled. He'd been tracking wolves using collars with GPS tags and noticed something odd. Every predator in the area was avoiding that same part of the forest. Predators don't just avoid territory unless there's something bigger and badder already there, he said quietly. That was when I started to feel real fear, not for myself but for whatever was out there waiting to be found. The reports kept coming in, each one stranger than the last. Hunters said they felt like they were being stalked, even when no one was around. Some found their traps destroyed, their camps torn apart. One man claimed he woke up in the middle of the night to find his tent surrounded by animal bones, arranged in a perfect circle. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. When I was out on patrol, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, something fast and low to the ground, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The woods felt alive, like they were breathing around me. Max came back to the station one afternoon looking pale. He'd been reviewing footage from motion-activated wildlife cameras he'd set up near the dead zone. Most of the videos showed nothing unusual, just deer, raccoons, and the occasional bear. But one clip stopped him cold. It showed a figure moving through the trees, upright, like a human but wrong. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with long limbs and a hunched posture. Its head looked canine, like a wolf or a dog, but its movements were smooth and deliberate, almost too controlled for an animal. The eyes reflected red in the camera's night vision. Whatever this is, Max said quietly, it's not supposed to be here. Jamie had his own story to tell. He'd been hiking near the dead zone after school when he heard something strange, a voice calling his name. At first, he thought it was me or Walter, but then he realized it sounded like his mom's voice. The problem? Jamie's mom had been dead for years. I ran, Jamie told me later, his face pale and serious. I didn't stop until I got home. Walter tried to keep things calm at the station, but even he couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. One evening, he went out on patrol near the dead zone and came back. Different. His usual calm demeanor was gone. He was jumpy and irritable, snapping at everyone over small things. He said he didn't remember much about his patrol, just flashes of movement and strange sounds, but I noticed scratches on his arms that looked too clean to be from branches. Things escalated quickly after that. Max found wolf tracks near one of his cameras, massive ones, but halfway through the trail, they changed into human footprints. Not just similar to human prints, they were asterisk human prints. I started digging into local history after that. Indigenous tribes had stories about creatures called the Long Teeth, hunters who had been cursed for breaking sacred laws. They were said to stalk people who entered forbidden hunting grounds. At first, I thought it was just folklore until I found something else. Deep in the woods near an abandoned mining site, I stumbled across a structure made entirely of bones and sinew. It wasn't random. It had been built carefully, almost artistically. The sight made my stomach turn. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just hunting animals anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about the structure I found in the woods. Bones and sinew don't just pile themselves up like that. Someone, or something had built it. It wasn't just a warning, it felt like a message. But for who, and why? Max was the first to say what we were all thinking but too scared to admit. This isn't normal wildlife behavior, he said quietly, one night at the station. This thing, whatever it is, it's smart. It's planning. Jamie nodded, his face pale. It's hunting us. At first I wanted to argue to say it was just an animal acting out of instinct, but deep down, I knew they were right. The tracks, the patterns, the way it seemed to play with its victims before striking, it reminded me of something I'd seen before. Serial killers. The thought made my stomach churn. I'd spent years studying human predators, learning how they thought, how they chose their victims. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just an animal, it was something worse. The sightings became more frequent after that. Hunters reported hearing voices in the woods, familiar voices that didn't belong there. Some said they saw glowing red eyes watching them from the shadows. Max's cameras picked up more footage of the creature, but every time we tried to track it, it vanished without a trace. One night, Jamie came running into the station, out of breath and shaking. He'd been walking home when he saw it, standing at the edge of the woods near his house. It wasn't just watching me, he said, his voice trembling. It smiled. I didn't know what to say to him. How do you comfort someone when you're just as scared as they are? Walter wasn't doing any better. He'd started sleepwalking, wandering off into the woods at night without remembering how he got there. One morning, he came back with scratches on his face and dirt under his nails, but no memory of where he'd been. It's inside my head, he whispered to me once when no one else was around. I can feel it. That was when I realized this thing wasn't just hunting us, it was playing with us, testing us, and I was starting to think we wouldn't survive its game. Things went from bad to worse after that. Every day, it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The reports of strange sightings and attacks kept piling up, but now people were starting to disappear. A pair of hikers went missing near the dead zone. We launched a search and rescue operation, combing the area for days. What we found wasn't them, but it was something. Their backpacks were torn apart, and their boots were left neatly side by side in the middle of a clearing. Around them, someone or something had arranged leaves in a perfect spiral pattern. At the center of it all were two human eyes, staring blankly up at us. I'll never forget that sight. None of us will. Max started digging deeper into the history of the area, trying to find some kind of explanation. He found records of disappearances going back centuries, hunters, trappers, even entire families who had vanished without a trace. The dates lined up with specific astronomical events, lunar eclipses, solstices, things like that. It's like a cycle. Max said one night at the station, his voice low and urgent. Every few decades it wakes up. What wakes up? I asked. He hesitated before answering. Something old, something that doesn't belong here. Jamie had his own encounter not long after that. He'd been out setting up trail cameras when he heard something behind him. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. He turned around and saw it. It was huge. He told me later, his hands shaking as he spoke. Like a wolf, but standing on two legs. It had antlers, like a deer. But its eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They were human. Jamie managed to run and hide until it left, but he wasn't the same after that. None of us were. Walter was getting worse too. He'd started talking to himself, muttering things I couldn't understand. One night, I caught him carving strange symbols into his desk at the station with his pocket knife. It's calling me, he said when I confronted him. I can hear it in my dreams. Max found something else during his research. An old legend from the indigenous people who once lived in these mountains. They spoke of a creature called the Huntmaster, a guardian spirit that had been corrupted by greed and violence. It was said to hunt those who entered its territory, testing their strength and fear before deciding if they were worthy prey. It doesn't just kill, Max said grimly. It plays with you first. That night, we heard howling outside the station, low and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. When we checked the cameras the next morning, we saw it standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't hiding anymore. I knew we couldn't keep waiting for this thing to come to us. People were disappearing. Walter was losing his grip on reality, and Jamie was terrified to even step outside. If we didn't do something, it was only a matter of time before one of us became its next victim. Max was the one who suggested we go to the caves. He'd been studying maps of the area and found references to an old network of caves deep in the dead zone. According to his research, They'd been used by smugglers during Prohibition and might be connected to the creature's hunting grounds. It's where it retreats, Max said. If we're going to stop it, that's where we'll find it. I didn't like the idea of walking straight into its territory, but what choice did we have? We packed what little gear we had: flashlights, radios, a first aid kit, and our standard issue firearms. I wasn't sure bullets would do much against something like this, but I wasn't about to go in unarmed. Jamie wanted to come with us, but I told him to stay at the station. He was brave, braver than most adults I knew, but I couldn't risk his life. He argued at first, but finally agreed when I promised we'd come back for him. Walter insisted on coming, even though he was barely holding it together. Part of me wanted to leave him behind, but I knew he'd just follow us anyway. Besides, he might know something, whether he realized it or not. The hike to the caves was brutal. The deeper we went into the dead zone, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the leaves. It felt like walking into a graveyard. When we finally reached the caves, my stomach turned. The entrance was marked with more of those strange symbols Walter had been carving, spirals and jagged lines that seemed to hum with some kind of dark energy. Inside, the air was cold and damp. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness as we moved deeper into the tunnels. The walls were covered in carvings, tallies marking names and dates that went back hundreds of years. Some of the names were familiar, people who had gone missing recently. Then we found its den. Bones were scattered everywhere, animal and human alike. At the center of the chamber was a massive structure made of antlers, sinew, and skulls. It looked like some kind of altar. And then we heard it. A low growl echoed through the cave, followed by heavy footsteps. The hunt master stepped into the light of our flashlights, towering over us with its antlers scraping against the ceiling. Its eyes glowed red, but its pupils were human, cold and calculating. Walter froze, his breathing ragged. "It's inside me," he whispered again. Before I could stop him, he stepped forward toward the creature like he was in a trance. It didn't attack him. It just watched as he dropped to his knees in front of it. "Walter," I shouted, but it was too late. Max acted fast. He grabbed a flare from his pack and lit it, throwing it at the creature's feet. The sudden burst of light startled it, giving us just enough time to pull Walter back. "It has a weakness," Max said as we scrambled for cover behind a rock formation. "Its heart. It's still human." The creature roared and charged at us with terrifying speed. Max shoved me out of the way just as it swiped at him with claws like knives. He screamed as it dragged him toward its altar. I didn't think. I just acted. Raising my gun, I aimed for its chest and fired. The first shot missed, but the second hit its mark. The creature let out an ear-piercing howl before collapsing to its knees. But as it fell, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Movement in the shadows behind it. There wasn't just one huntmaster. The creature collapsed, its massive body crumpling to the ground. For a moment, the cave was silent except for the sound of my own breathing. I thought it was over. Then I saw them, shapes moving in the shadows. More of them. There wasn't just one huntmaster. There were others, watching us from the darkness, their glowing red eyes reflecting off the walls of the cave. My heart pounded as I realized we were surrounded. "Diana, go," Max shouted, his voice hoarse with pain. He was still lying near the altar, clutching his side where the creature had slashed him. Blood pooled around him, but his eyes were fierce. "Get out of here. Take Walter and run." I didn't want to leave him, but I knew he was right. We couldn't fight them all. Grabbing Walter, who was barely conscious, I pulled him to his feet and started running back toward the cave entrance. Behind me, I heard Max light another flare. The last thing he said before the creatures descended on him was, "Remember what I told you, its heart." We barely made it out alive. The creatures didn't follow us past the entrance, but I could feel their eyes on us as we stumbled back through the forest. Walter was muttering under his breath the whole time, his words slurred and nonsensical. When we finally reached the ranger station, Jamie was waiting for us. He ran to help me get Walter inside, but when he saw my face, he froze. They're still out there, I said quietly. That night, I wrote my report, the official version of what happened, but I left out most of the truth. No one would believe me anyway. Walter didn't last long after that. A week later, he took his own life. Jamie started having strange dreams, visions of being hunted through familiar terrain, and I couldn't help but wonder if he'd been marked somehow. As for me, I stayed in the Adirondacks. The Park Service transferred me to a different area after my report caused too much controversy, but I didn't leave. I couldn't leave. I started teaching wilderness survival classes, not just for hikers and campers, but for people who might one day need to face something far worse than getting lost in the woods. The hunt masters are still out there. I know they are, and one day they'll wake up again. Next time we'll be ready.